All right, everyone, let's get started. I'd like to welcome you to today's webcast, Diagnosing Digital Performance, Getting to Why with UX Research. For those of you who aren't familiar with AnswerLab, a quick bit of context for this presentation. AnswerLab is a user experience research firm focused on digital experiences. We have the privilege of working with many industry-leading companies, helping them to envision new digital marketing opportunities, optimize existing ones, and measure their impact. Today we're going to be talking about how user experience research can shed light on digital performance issues, or as we like to call them, digital red flags. Your speaker is AnswerLab CEO, Amy Buckner-Chowdhury. Amy founded AnswerLab 10 years ago with a mission to improve lives through exceptional digital experiences, and has spent more than a decade helping brands build better digital products. If you have questions for Amy as we go through the webcast, go ahead and type them in the chat box or the QA box. It's on the right of your screen. We'll be sure to address them at the end of the presentation. Also, everyone attending will receive access to the event recording afterwards. And with that, I'm going to pass you over to Amy.
Great. Thanks so much, Tanya. Before we get into the meat of the presentation, I just wanted to mention that this webinar is really just one of many ways that you can access AnswerLab's content on user experience research and digital performance metrics. We regularly publish blog articles on Inc. magazine and Medium and in AnswerLab's blog, and we have a range of reports on best practices from mobile to smartwatch apps to very specific industry reports in pharma, auto, retail, and financial services. So at the end of this presentation, we'll show you how you can get access to more of our original research. We'd love to make that available to all of you guys. So today I'm going to talk about how UX research tools and methodologies can help you better diagnose problems and understand the context behind your digital performance. So have any of you been to Yosemite? Since you signed up to this webcast, I think you probably agree that analytics are really critical to helping us evaluate our digital performance. But analytics are really just one dimension for how we can evaluate our effectiveness. We can look at analytics in the same way you might look at a map for Yosemite like this one. So you might look at the distance from Yosemite Falls and think, oh, I can walk 7.6 miles. I know where point A and where point B is. This will be a breeze. But you often need another dimension to really help you understand what's ahead of you. And knowing that distance from point A to point B is really not enough. 7.6 miles at sea level is just not the same as 7.6 miles with 2,600 feet of elevation gain. And so when you're going on this hike in the mountains, you also need a map with topography so you know what level of exertion that you're in for and whether or not you'll need to pack emergency gear in case you pass out from exhaustion on the trail. So the same is true really with your business. These data sources here can show you when there's a problem with your digital performance. But these tools give you a very detailed information about what happened. They're sometimes like having a map without the topography. They pinpoint areas of concern like abandoned shopping carts or poor adoption, but knowing that there is a problem is really only half the battle. Sometimes you need to get to the why behind the data in order to know what to do with the data. So for the next 30 or 40 minutes, depending upon how fast I talk, I'll start by telling you what kinds of companies rely on UX research when they use it and show you some specific examples of how they're used to create exceptional experiences. I'm going to share some practical tools and some methodologies to help you better diagnose problems and understand the context and story behind your analytics. And we'll go through a case study today through each one of these questions. So first, I want to mention that you're not alone in your interest in joining this webinar and your desire to get it to the heart of why. There are top brands in really every category grapple with how to interpret all their data. And these are just a few that we work with. More and more companies are finding they need to add UX research to their analytics mix, whether they do it by themselves with companies like AnswerLab or with other partners. And more companies are really pairing their digital analytics with UX research to answer all sorts of questions at many points along the digital marketing and product development lifecycle that you see here. And they're finding that the results of combining the two are greater than the sum of its parts. So let's take an example for a minute to demonstrate how user experience insights can help illuminate the why behind aggregate data. So if we kind of look at this case study here, if 100,000 users come to this digital property and 30,000 of them have an intent to purchase, but only 6,000 of them complete the task, what's happening? Was it a failed user experience? What about the user experience is causing this drop-off? The methodologies that I'll be sharing today and the case studies that I go over are going to focus right on this gray zone you see here on the screen. It's how do we uncover all of the issues that are pulling customers out of this conversion funnel. And here's another example that I'm going to return to later in the presentation as the fifth case study. But last spring, there were reports that interest in the Apple Watch had dropped significantly after its initial launch. And that's really useful data to know, but why? Why was consumer interest waning? We might have very general interest. It could be that there were problems with consumers' perceived value of the watch and smartwatches generally. And really, if any of you bought the Apple Watch when it first came out, you might know why. The first apps for it were just terrible. But we're going to talk more about that at the end of this presentation. And so let's get started first with the first case study. So in this example, I want to really illustrate how we used UX research to get to the bottom of a conversion data red flag. This is an example of an automotive client's site redesign. And when they went through the redesign of their quote request process, they discovered an unintended outcome, which is that they were getting significantly fewer dealer requests coming in. So whether conversion for you is someone requesting more information or filling out a registration form or completing a purchase, you want more of them, not less. And so for automotive companies, the number of dealer quote requests is a key conversion metric. And so seeing this go down after a redesign was a big problem for them. And I want to illustrate here what that looked like. So they looked into the site analytics to see what was happening. And this is an illustration of the steps in their dealer request process. And you see here, this red step 3, this is where all the problems happened. 40% of their site visitors were dropping out of the request to dealer quote flow on the dealer selection page. So the client needed to understand, why is everyone dropping out here? But the drop-off could be caused by any number of reasons, right? Visitors could have changed their mind. Was the form too long? Was it that people just didn't want to provide any personal details as they were going through the process? And the answer to why is completely necessary, because in order to fix this problem, we need to know what's causing it. So to uncover the why, we need to understand the mindset of all of the users when they're going through this dealer quote request process. We need to understand, what were they thinking on that dealer selection page? Was there some information that was missing from it? And what was actually causing them to leave? So to uncover the why, we conducted a controlled experiment with a behavioral tracking survey. These are designed to provide insights into how people navigate through a site, as well as giving you a sense of their overall experience. So this particular study we did asked participants to conduct tasks, and then we tracked the unique clicks and paths that they took while they were doing those tasks. And we asked users to then give us candid feedback as they go along the way. You can use a couple of tools for this. Qualtrics can offer this, and UserZoom as well. You can invite 200 target customers to do specific tasks. In this case, we had a request a quote task. And you can set up the survey to take about 20 to 30 minutes and have about 30 to 40 questions in it. And the best thing about this kind of methodology is that it gives us a real quantitative user experience metrics, how people are rating their experience. It gives us behavioral metrics so we can see what they're clicking on and where they're dropping off. And then through open-ended questions, we can get to the qualitative insight. And more specifically, we can trigger very specific questions on very specific pages to determine why people are falling off on that particular page. So when we did this study, what we learned was that the behavioral data in the tracking study actually matched perfectly the behavioral data that the client was seeing in their own analytics. And you can see it's so beautiful when this happens, because it really validates doing this type of methodology. But it allows us then to dig into the qualitative survey responses that we triggered when people were leaving that particular page. And what we learned is that there was a smaller drop-off at the beginning of the process, And it confirmed an earlier hypothesis that visitors didn't want to provide their phone numbers and their addresses, and it wasn't really clear to them why that particular information was optional. But we also had a big aha. And this is where the research really paid off, because what we discovered is that on that dealer select page where people were falling off, many of those visitors thought they had reached the last step. It wasn't that people were intentionally abandoning this whole process. So imagine how worse that is for our client overall. Not only was the conversion lower, but likely lots of customers were sitting around waiting for an answer to their quote request and not seeing it because they thought they'd completed the process. So we investigated further into looking at the feedback from the users and looking in closely at the page. We discovered a couple of problems. One was that this page gave a confirmation message way too soon in the process. It was misleading. And the next step button was not located prominently enough on the page for users to understand they needed to click it to continue. So these insights were gold for the client. They gave us a clear understanding of the underlying issue, and it gave us a roadmap for fixing them. In this case, the automotive client was able to eliminate their drop-off and increase their conversion by making the progress indicator in the process more prominent so people saw there were multiple steps, by eliminating the misleading confirmation message, and then ultimately by explaining why some of that personal information was required along the way. So getting to the why allowed them to focus on increasing conversion in the right way. So let's go to case study number 2. We work with a higher education client to answer a question for them, which was essentially, why is our landing page bounce rate so high? This company had invested millions of dollars into an online ad campaign to recruit new students to the school. And when they did that, they discovered that their campaign microsite was performing very poorly. They had extremely high bounce rates from their lead generation microsite, and the visitors were not submitting their contact information as they had hoped. So what the client wanted to do was to get more folks to stay on the page and to convert more in order to realize their full investment in this ad campaign. And so we had to get to the why. Why was the bounce rate so high? And we had a number of hypotheses. Could it be that the site didn't meet the expectations of the users that are arriving on it? Could it be that the ad was poorly targeted to people? Or could it be that the form for people to complete out on the microsite, was it too long? So to get to the why, we kind of had to understand a few things. We needed to know who's really coming here. We needed to understand what were they trying to do after they clicked the ad, what did they want to do, and we needed to understand why in their minds were they leaving the site. So in this scenario, to understand who was coming and what they were seeking, we conducted a post-site visit intercept survey. So we were able to intercept visitors just as they were leaving the site. And what the advantage of this type of approach is it allows us to get a very brief profile of the users and very quick feedback through a small survey. It's no more than 10 questions. It's reliable because we're putting the survey there at the point of bounce. We're not asking people days later or hours later to recall why they might have bounced. And we add just a small line of JavaScript to the page. But I do want to note that for something like this, you do require a large amount of traffic to the site in order to get enough people to be able to answer it. So fortunately for this client, they'd invested a lot in the campaign, and they were driving a lot of traffic. And so the results of this survey were really interesting. It helped us understand who was coming to the site and what they were trying to accomplish. And most importantly, we saw that when the visitors were clicking the ad, they simply wanted to learn more by researching more across the site. And you see here the answer responses here. All of these responses that came up for why they were even coming to the site in the first place was simply to learn more on the site. And what they expected to do was explore a lot of program content, but instead they were being presented with a form to start a registration process. So this is where the mismatch occurred. There's a mismatch between the intent of the visitors and the content of the microsite. The visitors who clicked the ad were an earlier stage in their customer journey. They were just in their awareness stage. They were trying to get to know the brand. But the ad was getting people who were really potential students who were in information-seeking mode, but then the landing page was trying to convert them way too soon. So visitors weren't really ready to make a commitment of entering their personal information. So we identified for the client a huge opportunity to keep these visitors engaged and nurturing them to be potential students. And we did that by allowing us to then get down to some tactical recommendations for keeping that paid traffic on the client's website. The client needed to give them more paths to learn more on the site before they asked for personal information. And they needed to give those users more control of how their personal information was going to be used. So using this kind of intercept methodology really allowed us to get right to the heart of what was causing the bounce rates for this client. Now we'll go into case study 3. So one of our clients is a peripherals manufacturer. So, they make like keyboards and mice and things you hook into your computer. And this client had been paying for additional display content, which was essentially an explainer video. And they were placing it on various third-party shopping sites like Amazon and Best Buy. And what they were seeing through their data was that there wasn't much engagement in these videos. And they wanted to understand why, and should we be reinvesting in these, or should we get rid of this video content altogether, because it was pretty expensive for them. So to drill down on this a little bit more, the red flag for them around the low engagement was that there was hardly any consumption of this video content. Only 2% of the visitors to one of the product pages was looking at the product video feature. And in fact, they discovered that the video was the least visited area of the page. So it made them think, why are we investing in this? But of course, we needed to know more than just this data point. We needed to know why. And we needed to develop some hypotheses. Is it that they don't notice this content? Is it they don't need the content in the video? Is it that they don't like the content in the video? And the recommendation that we would end up giving the client based on each one of these would be very different depending upon what the outcome is. So to get started on developing a survey approach or a study approach, we knew we needed to do a couple of things. We needed to learn, did shoppers notice the video content? Do they value the video content? And could the video content be improved? So our study design had to really support these things. So to answer these questions, we conducted a one-on-one lab study with eye tracking. We recorded participant gaze behavior using Toby, and the interview portion that we did, in addition to the eye tracking, really gave us an opportunity to ask participants what they were thinking and feeling as they moved through tasks on the site. We could go back and talk to them and say, well, what were you thinking here? So what we do is we essentially target users to come into the lab, and we gave them specific tasks to complete on the product pages. We tracked everywhere with Toby, and we looked and analyzed all of that data. Now, I want to pause here and mention that with eye tracking studies, you have to use them with laser precision. You have to be very careful with the interpretation. Heat maps can be very dangerous without context and just sent around an organization. And, with eye tracking, the analysis can be never-ending if you don't have a very specific hypothesis or experimental design. But this particular client problem was just the perfect case study for using this kind of methodology because we had such a narrow question to ask. And so I wanted to show some results of those eye tracking sessions. These are gaze plots, and they show the number of items and places shoppers looked on a page before they looked at the video product content. So you'll see they looked at, in scenario 1 here, they looked at 59 different places before they looked at the video content. In scenario 2, they looked at 70 different places. And this last scenario is actually on Amazon, where they looked 290 different places before they ever paid attention to the video content. And so we needed to understand a little bit more about this, so I'm going to drill down into the Amazon example. This heat map shows how much users looked at different parts of the Amazon detail page. And the areas where the users looked the most are in the red, and the yellow areas have slightly few, and the green indicates areas with the fewest views. So did the participants notice this video content? Well, you can see here where this big empty box is, overwhelmingly no. And when we reviewed the site, again, with our users in the one-on-one interviews, we learned that they dismissed these videos as annoying branding ads. rather than instructional videos. In fact, in our conversation, we learned that people had more questions about the product, like what's it like to hold the product, or what's the installation or the setup process like, or what happens when I plug it in, or what's it like to use the product. And all of these questions that they had that were not answered from looking exhaustively over the product page were actually answered in the instructional video that was in the center. So I want to stop here for a minute and underscore why it was so important to do this kind of second level of analysis in a study like this. If the client had just looked at their behavioral data and seen that only 2% of the visitors were engaging with it, they might have just said, wow, no one's using it, let's get rid of it. But by getting to the why, we learned that the content was actually invaluable and that would help users get closer to a purchase decision if they only knew what the true payoff of the video was. So as a result of this insight, the peripherals manufacturer was able to focus on some tactical actions to make this video content more discoverable and to provide some more visual indicators that the video really contains lower funnel content that's helpful for making purchasing decisions rather than being a fluffy ad. So think about this again. It's kind of where do we put content at the right stage for someone in their customer journey, and this content was at a lower stage in the customer journey, but it was being perceived as much more branding and higher level journey stuff. So rather than scrapping the videos, the client was able to focus on making them more enticing and creating hooks for them to use them. So let's go into case study number 4. So we work with an online business that helps people construct their family trees. And they have more than 2 million users and a subscription model that has a free trial offering. So as you might imagine, it's critical to the health of this business to minimize drop-off and to improve conversion rate from a free trial. So they want everyone who does a free trial to convert if they can. But the client had a data red flag, and that was that they discovered some general churn going on. Many customers were abandoning the service, and in particular, they were abandoning it right after the free trial. So the client needed to understand why people didn't like the service enough to become customers after the free trial. So we had to get to why. And the client had some strong hypotheses. They thought there could probably be some usability issues that they needed to address on the site, or that maybe there's the wrong content being made available to them. So we wanted to get to the bottom of this and see what might be wrong. So while the client had hypothesized that there were usability issues, we weren't so sure. So we didn't think it made sense to just apply a standard usability study to this scenario. So we wanted to use multiple methods to get at the answer. So we conducted a diary study so we could track people's feedback to us as they're going through their initial experience. So they're in their natural environment and they're answering questions and giving us updates over how that's going through the free trial. And then we wanted to follow up with in-depth interviews with them post the free trial. But we also wanted to understand what's the experience for former new and loyal subscribers so that we could get insights into the factors that were affecting churn among other groups. So we did online focus groups to talk with them. So using multiple methods here. And what we learned is that the subscription churn really had nothing to do with the usability or the content and features of the product. It had everything to do with the customer's research patterns. People who churned actually considered themselves what I would call intermittent users of the service. They really loved the service, but they got so involved that they completely burned themselves out and had to take a break. And they wanted to use the service for a while and then take a break until they had time to go and devote to it again. So it wasn't about having a problem with the service, it's how they wanted to research. So rather than implementing or recommending a usability fix, we recommended the client build a new revenue stream by offering a new membership model. So the current monthly subscription model at that time was either on or off, and that didn't really align with how people wanted to use it. So we suggested a subscription level that allowed the client to have consistent recurring revenue, but then also allowed the users to have access for a limited number of days of the week. So the user could deep dive and then rest, but without being charged extra for those times of rest. So if we focus on understanding why people behave the way they do, we can build much better customer solutions. Had the client just followed their original hypothesis, rather than getting truly to the why behind the churn data, they would have found a bunch of usability issues to fix, but they really wouldn't have uncovered a new revenue stream. So let's go on to case study number 5, and this is our original smartwatch story. I happen to be particularly interested in the wearable space. I was so excited to get the Apple Watch. Smartwatches have really been around a couple of years, mostly among early tech adopters, but I was really curious to see if Apple would push them to mainstream, and how might that change the digital landscape. But once it went live, we saw that the market data after the original Apple smartwatch launch showed kind of waning interest in the 3 months of sales, and the interest hasn't recovered as much. So we wanted to understand what are the reasons behind the low adoption, and if brands are starting to think about addressing this tiny screen, how might they approach this new platform? So we did our own study to get to the bottom of things. And we had some questions, of course, back to our why hypotheses. We had a number of theories. Was it that people just didn't find that the watch is very useful? Is it that it's too expensive for the average consumer? Or is it that it doesn't meet the expectations of what people want from a smartwatch? And so we had to put together a series of questions to really define what our approach would be. We needed to understand how the actual watch usage compared to the expectations of users, and how do the users use those watches in conjunction with their phones. And we also wanted to understand what's the gap between what the watches can do and what users really want them to do. So for this study, to get this insight about the expectations and use cases, we conducted in-depth interviews in a usability lab. So the great thing about in-depth interviews is it allows us to kind of get first-hand observation of the interactions with the smartwatch and the mobile app. And the IDIs allow us to ask more questions around usage patterns and their unmet needs and their satisfaction levels. So for this study, we talked to owners who've owned a watch for a month or longer, and we also talked to prospects who've been intending to purchase the watch within the last 6 months. And we discussed and demonstrated how we had them discuss and demonstrate how they commonly use the watches. And we looked at the Apple Watch and the Moto 360, the Samsung Galaxy Gear Live, and the Pebble. And this, what you see on the screen here, is a photo of our lab setup. And you see there's a pillow. We need a pillow because wrists and arms get really tired when they're being held for a long period of time talking about things. If you hold up your arm for a few seconds, you can see you really don't want to hold it up that long before you get bored and your arm hurts. So what we learned was really interesting. And it was very disappointing for smartwatch brands. We saw that for owners and prospective buyers alike, they found today's smartwatches to be fun, and they thought of them as a nice-to-have, but ultimately they considered them to be a luxury item. The participants were really disappointed by hardware limitations of the devices, but the most important thing we learned is that they found that the apps that were on these devices did not provide their anticipated value. And you'll see here just some quotes from different users. And really this last quote here, "I want the watch to do more," being really indicative of what we heard from most people. So we discovered that the reason why the adoption hasn't been as high is because there's app apathy. We learned that the smartwatch apps aren't cutting it, and they're really dragging the smartwatches down with them. And the dearth of the killer apps has just been lowering the value proposition of the smartwatch as a whole. So we focused our attention on these apps after watching people interact with loads of the apps for days on end, and we were able to isolate 5 key components of smartwatch apps that will move them forward on and make them truly indispensable. And so for clients that want to experiment with this tiny screen, we recommend 5 key things. 1, getting intimate with users. If the smartwatch can track a heart rate, it should at least remember what you added to your cart when you were on your desktop once you get to your smartwatch. You have to curate ruthlessly. There's not enough real estate to include optional features. Apps must have really minimal functions and interactions. And we recommend enabling bite-sized interactions. I mentioned that arms and wrists get tired, so customers can really only engage with the watch for small tasks. And you have to leverage the device ecosystem. Because real estate is really limited, we have to allow users to pick up on one screen and continue tasks seamlessly between mobile, desktop, and smartwatch. And then lastly, we discovered you have to show utility now. You really only have one shot at making a first impression in a smartwatch app because users don't spend a lot of time sitting around browsing app stores for fun and trying apps over and over again. So the first opening of the app must make it really clear what the value proposition is. So this case study and the insights we got of it are really just another illustration that if you're noticing a drop in conversion at your company or for a product or a website, whatever your conversion might be, that user experience research can really get to the heart of the issue and it can offer recommendations for turning it around. So in summary today, we covered 5 research tools for getting to the why in your analytics. We covered quantitative behavioral tracking surveys. We covered eye tracking study, an intercept survey, one-on-one usability testing, and online focus groups and diary studies. There are so many tools, though, for really understanding why. There are a lot of tools in the user experience toolbox. So a question for you is how will you uncover the hidden insights in your data? So you can partner with user experience insight teams in your own organization, or you can use outside partners like AnswerLab depending upon the kind of bandwidth or resources that you have. And of course, we're always willing to be a sounding board for you. We love developing solutions for our clients and friends. So before we jump to the Q&A, I just wanted to show you where you can access more original content from AnswerLab. I have a standing series on Inc.com that you can visit. Both AnswerLab and I have standing publications on Medium. And of course, you can go to answerlab.com directly where you can access all of our best practices content and our insights in our blog. And if you'd like to be informed when we launch something new, just follow us at the Twitter handles that you see there. And so now I'd like to open it up to your questions. Perhaps you have an analytics red flag you'd like to diagnose. And if so, we'd love to answer those for you. Okay, so we have a question here. For your automotive example, what types of testing, if any, was done prior to launch? That's a great question, and actually something I wanted to make a point of. Why it's so important that a client actually does testing before launch. I think that this particular problem would have been discovered had the client done some really great prototype testing before they even started the process. They would have seen that they could have probably done this in fewer steps. That instead of having 4 or 5 steps to do request a quote, they could have done it in 1. And I think they would have, right off the bat, not seen any drop-off. And so that I'm glad that whoever asked that question asked it because it really illustrates how important it is to not wait until you see a problem to do research, but to include this kind of research in your whole development process. Okay, let's see some other questions here. One question is, how would you recommend we monitor ongoing changes versus just waiting for big problems to crop up? So that's also a great question. So on the one end, you need to be doing UX research along the entire product development cycle so that what you launch is going to be the best possible user experience it can be. But then once something's in the field, there could be a lot of situations that come up that mean you need to address things. And how do you see what's going on before there's a big problem? So there are a couple ways you can do that. One is to have a really strong voice of the customer program. There are a variety of tools for that in the marketplace. AnswerLab happens to provide a solution called UX Impact, and we use Qualtrics for it for our clients. And we help our clients track over a period of time across desktop, mobile, and tablet what their experiences are, and we provide them with a UX score that they can track, and we highlight issues and then allow them to deep dive into what the problem is, and then we give them some recommendations to fix it. So really having that ongoing voice of the customer is super important. Another question that came up is, we can't test everything with users. What would you say are the big impact items to test when launching a new campaign? That is also an excellent question. So That's true. There's only so much budget to go around when you're about to launch a marketing campaign, and there's only so much time to get a marketing campaign ready. So it's not realistic to think that you would interject some kind of user experience research every single time. But you can do some foundational research that says, what are best practices for setting up a campaign? What kinds of landing pages do we need to have that will really be sticky? And if you can do the foundational research and set the best practices and then instruct the teams to follow those best practices every time, you have a much better shot of ensuring that you'll have the payoff from the campaign over time. All right, and then just one last question here. Could you enlist some tools you generally use to gather the data you presented? Yes, so I mentioned Qualtrics is a tool that we use. Another tool we have used from time to time is UserZoom. We also use our own labs, of course, and Moray is a way to track what we're seeing with customers. And those are the big ones. We use quantitative and qualitative, and I mentioned Toby. Toby's who we use for eye tracking. And of course, we have labs here in San Francisco and labs in New York as well. So if anyone would love to come in and just see how we've set things up, sometimes I hear that people are trying to get inspiration for their own labs or want to understand what are some of the tools they can use, we're happy to show those. Okay, so that is the last of our questions, and I thank you all so much for your time. I hope that you will be able to continue to follow our series of content and follow AnswerLab and myself on Twitter so that we can get more great content out to you. Thanks so much for your time today.
Thanks, Amy. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. See you next time.